Well, joining us now is Jim Samra, author of God Told Me. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Gordon.
Well, the Bible is full of stories of God speaking, and usually through angels or through burning bushes or through an audible voice, sometimes a still small voice. Does God still speak to people today?
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I wrote this book is because there are lots of stories in the Bible, but I thought it was important to also share stories of everyday people. And so the book is loaded with stories of ordinary, average Christians of every different walk of life through whom God has spoken, who God has spoken to. We also found that as we began to ask people the question about God speaking to them, there were so many stories, we couldn't include them all in the book. So we created a website, godtoldmethebook.com, in which people can continue to tell their stories. And Gordon, you'd be amazed at just the many different ways God is speaking to people. He's done it throughout the history of the church, and he's continuing to do it on a regular basis today.
In all of your study and all the research, what would you say would be the predominant way that God speaks to people today?
In the book, I found that there are about 12 different ways that God reveals his guidance and direction in our lives. If I was asked to pick the primary ones, to me, it seems, especially through his written word, that sometimes when we're reading the scriptures, it seems that God speaks to us through a passage that was seemingly written thousands of years ago, but it jumps out at the page and it feels like God is addressing our exact situation and giving us guidance today. He also speaks through prayer, through circumstances. We can ask the Lord for signs. He speaks through godly counsel in the community of believers. There's a variety of ways that he speaks. If I had to pick one, though, I would say it's especially through his word and as we are praying our way through it.
Well, why is it so important to seek guidance from God?
It's because God's he's a much better decision maker than we are, and he knows things that we can't know. The story from the Bible that probably summarizes it best for me is that in Joshua chapter 9, the Israelites are moving into the promised land, and God has told them to go to each area and to conquer the people that are there. And the Gibeonites decide, well, if they come to us, we ought to make a treaty with them. And so they go to the Israelites and they disguise themselves and they say, we've come from a faraway land. Look how moldy our bread is. Look how dusty our shoes are. And there's this very telling verse in which it says that they examined the evidence, but they failed to inquire of the Lord. And they made a treaty with them, and they found out later that they had been tricked. And that to me says, there are just certain things that we can't know. We can't know the future, but God does know all of those things. And so when we turn to him for guidance and direction, we receive much better guidance than we could possibly give ourselves.
All right. Well, how can you be sure? How can you be sure it's God and not your own sort of hopes or dreams or wishes? How do you know?
Gordon, that is an excellent question. In fact, that is the question I am asked the most, bar none, when I talk to people about this concept. What I like to tell them is Jesus has promised in John chapter 10 that he has a distinct voice and that his sheep recognize his voice. And that the more you get used to listening to God's communication patterns, the more you begin to recognize it. In the book, I list, for example, 6 characteristics of how God speaks. One of those is he's often telling us to do something that's going to require us to trust him more. That if you hear that voice in your head or you feel that prompting to go out, to step out on faith, that's usually the Lord telling you to do that. Now, there are some things you can do to help ensure that your own voice is not really involved in the process. For example, I tell a story in the book about how I asked God to choose a spouse for me. And I made 2 requests of him. I asked, first of all, that he would choose somebody as my spouse who I didn't already know, and that he would choose somebody and tell me who it was before I saw her. That was my own feeble attempt to try to remove my voice from the process and have it be just the Lord's. And you know what? He was gracious and kind to answer both those requests.
Well, what would you say to somebody that I imagine you've run into people that said, I thought it was God, but it turned out to be wrong, and they got themselves into a mess. What would you tell them?
You know what, Gordon, that happens. There are times in which I thought I've heard from the Lord, and it turned out that I hadn't. And one of the things about God is that he's very kind in this whole process. And so there are a number of stories in the Bible with David or with Gideon where people of God ask for confirmation because they're not sure whether they've heard him or not. One of the things I tell people is, look, if God is speaking, he's not only going to speak to you, he's going to speak to others who might be involved. Ask for confirmation. If you think you've heard from the Lord but aren't sure, ask him. I'm reminded of the story that Francis of Assisi tells, where he has a dream and he thinks that God is telling him to join the army and be a soldier. And he does that. He pursues that path for a couple of months, I think it is. Later, God appears to him in a dream again and says, no, you misheard me. What I want you to do is be a soldier in my army. I want you to work for me. And so it's very possible, even for the best Christians, to sometimes mishear God's voice. And so when we ask for confirmation, God is gracious and generous and provides it.
How do we tune our ears so that we are listening and get to the point in our lives that we truly hear his voice? Where that verse you said before from John, that my sheep hear my voice, they know me. How do you get into a lifestyle of practicing that?
You know, one of the examples that helps with me is to think about the idea of voice recognition software. When you have voice recognition software, you have a known speech pattern, and then you can compare the unknown to the known. When it comes to God, the Bible is the known. He has spoken in his word. And so the more you're immersed in the Bible, the more you begin to pick up patterns of how God speaks, and it becomes easier and easier to recognize his voice. He may be saying different things than what is in the Bible, but he will say them in the same sort of way. The other thing that I tell people is by experience. And that's not only your own experience. This is one of the reasons why in the book it's so important that there are to hear different stories, and we've included stories in the book and on the website, is the more we hear how God has spoken to other people, the more we begin to recognize patterns, the way he speaks, the way he talks. I'm sure that for many of the listeners, if it was their spouse that was talking or a child or familiar voice, they would begin to pick up that voice immediately, and it's because they're so used to it. Well, when we immerse ourselves in the Bible and when we listen to how God has spoken to other people, we begin to recognize his voice, and we can identify it amidst the cacophony that we might have going on inside our own lives.
Well, Jim, great tips. If you want more information on his ministry, all you have to do is go to 700clubinteractive.com. And his book, God Told Me, it's available nationwide. Jim, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Gordon.
All right, Terry, over to you.